Christians are disappearing from the Middle East. No, it's not a mistake, it's systematic and it's efficient. There's an Islamist slogan that's been whispered for decades, and it goes like this: first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. The Saturday people are the Jews, the Sunday people are the Christians. And if you look at the numbers, this slogan is coming to life. In 1902, Christians made up roughly 25% of the Middle East. In 2026, they're at less than 4%. Entire ancient communities, older than most European nations, have been wiped out in a single generation. Genocides, mass expulsions, legal discrimination, cultural suffocation. And despite what many Western commentators claim, Tucker Carlson, Israel is not the cause of this pattern. It's actually the exception to it. As Islamist movements rise across the region and the world, Christians are consistently amongst the first targeted. And if you don't believe the headlines, believe the history. Because unfortunately, history isn't just a story, it's a warning to us all. And if we don't understand what happened to Christianity in the Middle East, and now in parts of Africa, we're not going to recognize the patterns that are happening again, and what they intend to do with the West. How did Christianity become almost extinct in the Middle East? We need to talk about what's really going on, because the media is definitely not going to be doing that. And so, this is the Mira K Show on JNS TV. Let's dive right in. Imagine a door in a quiet neighborhood in Mosul, Iraq. It's a door that has been in the same family for centuries. They are an indigenous Assyrian people, and they speak Aramaic, the same language their ancestors spoke before the Roman Empire even reached their shores. In the summer of 2014, a man with a spray paint can walks up to that door. He paints a single Arabic letter, Nun. It stands for Nasrani, Nazarene, a Christian. When that family wakes up and see that mark, they are given an ultimatum by ISIS that hasn't really been heard of in a millennium. Convert, pay a crushing infidel tax, or you are going to be executed by the sword. In a single weekend, Christianity was wiped from one of its oldest heartlands in Iraq. The homes were seized, the families fled on foot onto the desert with nothing, and the churches were desecrated. In 1904, Iraq had over 1 million Christians. In 2013, 500,000. Today, less than 150,000. And this story, unfortunately, isn't an isolated incident. It is the summary of what has happened to Christianity in the Middle East over the last century. But let's start from the beginning, because most people see the Middle East as the center of Islam. And today, they're right. But what most people don't realize is that long before Islam existed, Christianity was the stronghold of this entire region. It was Armenia, not Rome, that became the first nation in the world to adopt Christianity as its state religion. The shift from a Christian majority to a Muslim one wasn't an overnight event. It took 500 years of pressure following the initial violent Islamic conquests. With time, the Islamic stronghold grew, but Christians still lived here in massive numbers. During this time, and for hundreds of years, they are secondary citizens of the Middle East. They pay the jizya tax to the Muslims, but they live in semi-peace. This is under what is known as the dhimmi system. They live in a protected state of inequality, i.e. the Muslims are above and the Christians are below, and the Islamic Empire is unbelievably powerful. So it's an understood contract that exists between the two different religions. But then, things start to shift dramatically with the turn of the 20th century, when the old religious contract is replaced by a new, violent ethnic nationalism. This is the first pendulum swing, which became the kind of notorious way that Christians were treated in the Middle East. The 2026 JNS International Policy Summit will take place on April 15th to 17th at the Waldorf Astoria in Jerusalem. Register today at jnssummit.org and use the coupon code JNSTV, that is JNSTV, one word, to receive 20% off all tickets. I cannot wait to see you in Jerusalem. So what actually happened? The Ottoman Empire is on the verge of collapse, and there's an incoming shift in world order. Nations are desperately trying to prove their dominance, and they resort to violence. Take, for example, Turkey, who is working to rebuild itself away from said Ottoman Empire, which is failing. This is the era of the Young Turks, ironically, a name you might be familiar with from a popular left-wing American TV show. These Young Turks are secularists, and they are seeking to bring back Turkey's glory. To do so, they launch a three-pronged genocide throughout Armenia, Turkey, and Greece, in which millions are murdered for not being Turks. This story is not talked about nearly enough, but it is one of the worst marks on modern history. The genocided are, of course, in part Christian, and they are seen as a threat to Turkish dominion. And it's a little bit deeper than that, because anyone different is seen not just as a threat, but as the reason for the country's failure, and they must be removed at all costs. Of course, the Jews are not immune to this either, and in this era, a new precedent is established. Well, not a new one, but it's kind of set in tone. The scapegoating of a minority. When a country faces economic or military failure, the other is blamed for that failure and must be removed to purify the nation. Jews, Christians, Kurds, you name it. Just as the Ottoman Young Turks targeted their minorities to prove Turkish dominance, the newly independent Iraq used the Simile massacre against the Assyrian Christians to prove their own Arab dominance as well. It was the exact same script, but in 1933, and it's the beginning of this pendulum of attitude towards the Christian that has become their story for the last 100 years. These massacres occur, but the world is more focused on the world wars, which then end, and with that, there's a new reshaping of the Middle East, with Western countries trying to get their piece of their real estate. The old Ottoman map is torn up, and new countries like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon are carved out. As these new nations struggle to find their footing, they kill many Christians in hopes of finding it. Why? Well, the new era has dawned, and this is the age of secularists, and Christianity isn't exactly aligned with that. Which brings us to pendulum swing number 2. Instead of the old religious governance of the Islamist sultans, many of these new countries are looking to the West to see a different path. Secularism becomes the goal, not because the people all necessarily want it, but because many of the new military dictators are demanding it, seeing that they understand that religion is a big problem. Leaders like Nasser in Egypt and the Baathists in Syria and Iraq believe that religion is what kept the region backward. They want to move into this new age, and ironically for the Christians, this kind of feels like a lifeline. They think if the state is secular, then it doesn't matter that I'm a Christian. We aren't dhimmis anymore. We're not second-class citizens. We're just citizens. And in the spirit of this new unity, a term is coined, Arabism. The argument that the primary identity isn't Muslim or Christian, it's just Arab. And you're familiar with that till this day, where you'll often hear people refer to Arab Christians or Arab Muslims in the Middle East. For a while, by the way, this works. From the 1950s through the 70s, you see Christians at the highest level of government, the arts, and the military. They are professors and really a big part of the Arab Renaissance. But here was the big mistake. Seeing as many of them hitched their future with the dictators that had come in pushing this secularism, hoping to defend against Islamization, they thought Islamists would be kept at bay. But when those regimes faltered, the pendulum was ready to swing back with a vengeance, and how it does. This brings us to the third era. Despite the fact that the streets of the Middle East republics are feeling cosmopolitan, the secular regimes really failed to deliver on their promises of prosperity. They lost wars, their economies stagnated, and the people kind of grew resentful. In that vacuum of failure, a new and yet very old solution emerged: political Islam. The slogans in the streets changed from Arab unity to Islam is the solution, and you already know the drill of what happened in the likes of Iran. This now spreads, and Islamization is back. When the secular dream dies out of the Middle East, the Christians are left completely exposed. They had spent decades identifying as Arabs to fit in, but this new movement doesn't care because it cares about theology, and Christianity does not align with Islam. Islamic domination is now the name of the game, and the Christians are, of course, over the next 50 years, persecuted for their way of life. The Jews are long gone from most of these countries. They were expelled in the 1940s and 50s, and they kind of served as the canary in the coal mine, not unlike what we see today. But the world ignored the warning. Now the machinery of persecution turns towards the main other left. The Christians are seen as the remnants of the failed secular age and agents of the West, and they aren't all expelled, but many of them are forced to live under terrible conditions, which actually leads us to today. No, this isn't a historical lesson at this point. This is our current reality. A 2,000-year-old history has almost been erased in a century, starting as secondary citizens, moving on to genocides, moving on to a fake alliance of secularism, and then Islamization's back and the Christians are basically ousted. There was 20 to 25% Christians in 1904 in the Middle East, and now that number is struggling to remain at 4%. The reasons for this drastic decline is not just genocidal sprees, although there were many of those throughout the years done almost in entirety by Islamists or nationalists. It's contributed to multiple factors like emigration. Why would you stay somewhere that you can't be free to live your religion in peace? Let's be clear. Many Christians didn't want to leave, and many still stayed, but they were being squeezed out, their countries making their lives miserable. The idea of religious freedom was not accepted here. You have the return of laws that make it nearly impossible to build a church, let alone fix it, or testify equally in a courtroom. You've got your children being bullied and your businesses boycotted, and your safety is never guaranteed by the state because you are, in fact, a traitor, even if you're a traitor that is allowed to live in the same dominion. The Middle East didn't just lose its Christians to the sword or expulsions like the Jews, which is why there are still many of them in the Middle East. They lost them to a culture that stole their religious freedoms. In Lebanon, you see the most heartbreaking version of this theft because it was the one place specifically designed to be a sanctuary. When the borders were drawn in 1920s, Lebanon was the great exception, a country created with a clear 53% Christian majority so that the Sunday people would finally have a home where they weren't second-class dhimmis. It became the Switzerland of the Middle East, a beacon of banking and art and intellectual freedom, but the pendulum of the 20th century eventually broke into that sanctuary. Through a brutal 15-year civil war and the subsequent rise of Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed Islamist militia which created a state within a state, the Christian community saw their home culturally and politically occupied. And yes, this is the accurate term for occupation. Today, the majority has vanished. Christians have plummeted to roughly 33% of the population, and the theft wasn't just a single massacre like with Armenians, but a systematic hollowing out of the hope that forced most educated families to leave to the West, proving that even a country built for Christians couldn't withstand the crushing pressure of the surrounding monoculture of Islamification. Syria is another sad example of how the dictators providing Christian sanctuary were just temporary, and when the rise of ISIS began, they didn't see them anymore as neighbors. In 2011, they were given a choice, they being the Christians: convert, pay the tax, or die. In one decade, a community of 1.5 million Christians was basically halved. In Turkey, we have the most extreme example of total purification. This was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, a land that was 25% Christian just over a century ago. But through the Young Turk genocides and later population exchanges, the indigenous Christian foundation was systematically uprooted. Today, Turkey is 99.9% Muslim. Even as a supposedly secular republic, the state has seized thousands of church properties and made it illegal to even train new priests. For the few who remain, they aren't viewed as citizens. They are second-class problem. Iran is where the pendulum swung with the most violence in modern history. Before the 1979 revolution, Christians were a recognized and relatively prosperous part of the Iranian mosaic, but the Islamic Revolution turned them into targets overnight. Today, whilst they have a few token seats in parliament for show, it is a crime to hold a church service in the national language, and anyone caught sharing their faith faces years in prison for crimes against national security. It's a culture of total surveillance, where the state's goal isn't just to manage Christians, but to ensure they never grow. And of course, you've got Egypt, which today holds the biggest Christian community in the Middle East, but it is still a shadow of its old self. The story is the same. There were the Copts, who were the original indigenous people of the land. They had been squeezed by a slow grind of systematic discrimination, and whilst they once made up nearly 20% of the population, they are now roughly 10%, living under a legal noose, which makes repairing a church or seeking equal justice in court nearly impossible. It isn't always a massacre that shows the hatred towards a religion. It also is a culture of second-class status that forces the best and brightest to find their future elsewhere, i.e., an unforced expulsion. Christians in the Middle East have been treated horrifically in the last 100 years, let alone without religious freedoms. But let's for a second talk about the countries that maybe don't even have a history of Christians, like, let's say, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, because there you see a different kind of theft. There are millions of Christians living there today, mostly workers from India and the Philippines who keep their economies running. And did I say workers? I meant slaves. But their religious freedom is non-existent. In Saudi Arabia, it is 100% illegal to build a church or even pray in public. There are 0 official houses of worship in the entire kingdom. They're forced to worship in secret house churches. Importing a Bible in bulk, wearing a cross in public, can still lead to deportation or arrest. The Saudi monarchy justifies this by citing a tradition that no two religions shall exist in the Arabian Peninsula. This, by the way, is the supposed new best friend of America, a country that celebrates religious freedom and, of course, was built on Christianity. They won't allow you to showcase your religion in your garments or even a place to pray. In Qatar, the state is a little bit better than Saudi Arabia. They permit worship, but only in a single walled-off compound in the outskirts of the city, far away from the public eye, and yes, it kind of sounds like a ghetto. They want the labor of the Christian world, but they refuse to recognize the religious freedom or legitimacy of the Christian person. They want to look more modern and global than Saudi Arabia, but the freedom they offer is essentially religious segregation. And just like with the Saudis, this freedom only applies to foreigners. If a Qatari citizen was to convert to Christianity, they would face apostasy charges, which technically carry the death penalty. And so why are we talking about all of this tragic history of what happened here in the Middle East? Well, because it brings us home to Israel and an ongoing debate that has unfortunately gone a very bad way in the last few months. Despite the Tucker Carlsons of the world claiming otherwise, in Israel, the Christian population has actually grown over the last 100 years. And I want to be accurate and tell this story correctly, because there's a massive distinction to be made, and it's a mistake that people tend to make all of the time. In Israel, we're not looking at one piece of land when we talk about Christians. We are looking at 2 completely different cultural legal realities. When you look at the map of the Holy Land, the data split is jarring. This perfectly, by the way, illustrates the pendulum that we've been talking about, which doesn't actually identify the Middle East, it identifies the Islamist mentality. You see, inside Israel, under Israeli law, the Christian community has seen consistent year-over-year growth. In 1948, there were roughly 34,000 Christians in the new state. Today, that number has climbed to over 185,000. These aren't just foreigners. 75% are Arab Christians who fully integrated into society, serving as Supreme Court justices, leading medical departments, and attaining the highest level of education in the country. And to all the people who are claiming that the percentages have gone down, that's just because Israel has seen such an influx of people move in that the Christians haven't really hit the same amount of numbers as the Israelis, because that's how percentages work. However, under the Palestinian Authority, the Islamist entities, and Hamas, the story actually looks exactly like the regional norm that we have been seeing of erasure of Christians. In Bethlehem, let's say, the city where Jesus was born, 86% were Christians in 1950. But decades under the Palestinian Authority, it has now plummeted to roughly 12%. Gaza, under the Islamist rule of Hamas, the community has been almost entirely liquidated. And no, not by the IDF. A population that was 5,000 in 2005 is now fewer than 1,000. And when you hear stories of churches being attacked, almost always the perpetrators of that are from the Islamists. The reason for this split isn't a mystery. It's about the legal shield of a normal democracy versus the Islamist pendulum that believe in taking over. In Israel, religious freedom isn't a favor that it's granted by a dictator. It's a right that's codified into our laws, and it's protected by the robust Supreme Court. Christians don't have to play a secular gamble or pretend to be someone else to survive or pay a tax to us Jews. They can ring their church bells, educate their children in Christian schools, live under equal citizens under a law that doesn't care about their theology. Their churches are protected, and their historical sites are too. By contrast, in the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, the secular gamble failed just like it did in Syria and Iraq. As the secular Palestinian leadership weakened, the Islamist pendulum swung back, and the Christians there are caught in the same slow grind we see in Egypt. facing social pressure, discriminatory land laws, and a culture that increasingly views them as outsiders, even though it's their own homes. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sooner or later the world will need to come to terms with. Christians are the enemy of Islamists, as are Jews. Yet Jews in Israel are far from being the enemy of the Christians. Christians have been persecuted, murdered, exiled from most of the Middle East, and in Israel they have thrived. Their religious monuments and history has been protected, and yes, there is a reality of Israel being a Jewish state, but Christians are honestly welcomed here with open arms. Look, I'm not here to convince anybody to be Israel's friend. That's on you guys to decide. But the shift we have seen lately of Christians and Catholics turning their backs on Israel, manipulated by campaigns run by the same Islamists that persecute them, is heartbreaking. In many ways, it's the same story of the left. We know the Islamist media strategy by now. They look at a society that they want to destroy, they look for the strongest entity there, they pretend to buddy up with them in hopes that that entity will do the work of breaking apart the alliances that keep that country strong. That's what they're trying to do now with the Christians and the Jews. They understand that Christians and Jews together are a proper force against Islamization. And there's a reason the media is working so hard to find voices to prop them up, like Tucker Carlson, to pay them money to ensure that Christians back away from their only actual friend here in the Middle East. You know that the stories of Christian persecution is covered negligibly by the media. What's happening across Africa and Nigeria barely makes the news. And same with most of the stories that we covered here today. But do you know what stories do get covered? The stories of alleged Gaza genocide pushed by those same entities that know that Christians and Jews together provide a fierce and strong enemy against the Islamization. The story of the Christians in the Middle East and the slogans they play by first the Saturday people and then the Sunday people is a lesson that the world must heed. You don't need to look far to see what they have planned, and keep in mind the simple truth that before the Islamic takeovers, these locations had Christian majorities, just like the West does now. We learn history because it's here to teach us something, and learn it we must, because the lesson of this is gloomy, and the Christian story in the Middle East is heartbreaking. But in times of darkness, you have to look at the light and try and learn from it. And here, right now, the light, my friends, is Israel. I'm Ira Kay, and I will see you next time.